hope to accomplish here, the Friends of Mirror Lake Library, is to basically reconnect and reacquaint folks in the community with the library, which of course is St. Pete's original. It's going to be coming up on its 100th anniversary in 2015, and the Friends is a new group. We've been around for a year, and what we hope to do is really just start generating community interest so we can do a big bang in 2015. We also wanted people to just come into the library, get to know it, become a friend, and ulteriorly, we wanted to get some new, beautiful paintings of the library. We have that Milton Harworth watercolor that was done that the city owns, and we just thought this would be a great way for us to get new material that we can use for telling folks about the library. We can make up some book bags and coffee mugs and just have it hanging in the library.
Today we're having fun doing plein air painting, which means painting outside, painting what's in front of us. And we're doing it for a fundraiser for the library here. So later on we're going to sell the paintings and help the library, help the city, and have fun while we're at it.
I've been painting for about 5 years, and mostly landscapes, and there's nothing like painting outside to add life to your paintings.
Well, it's just a great event to come out and focus on what is a good piece of architecture in St. Pete, the library, and be able to paint it. And there's also a contest, so somebody could win some money.
And so, saying that, third place, friend's favorite, goes to Jean Towery. I'm so sorry, Jean. I saw your price tag, and your award is not going to be anywhere near your price tag. But we do have a money order for you for $200.
My goodness.
And we love it. Thank you so much. Goes in Sheila Thornton. And we just fell in love with Sheila's style. She has almost a Thoreau quality to her work. In fact, when I first saw it, I thought it was pastels. And I was like, oh, we got our first pastel artist. But Sheila, thank you so much for coming up to St. Petersburg and sharing your talent and expressing this beautiful picture of our building. Thank you. And here is your $300 Award of Excellence. Ron's work kind of explodes out of the picture. It almost is like one of those marble statues where the art is coming out and not yet finished, and yet it's as finished as it needs to be. It captures our building, it captures the details that we know as our Mirror Lake Library. And Ron, we're thrilled that that's best of show, and here is your $500 money order. Words for us.
Thank you. Well, don't leave. The only thing I wanted to say was I think Wayne is being way too modest. I mean, this event was really incredible. First time ever done. And when I did, I think I saw an email you sent out, and I was like, oh my God, how do I get involved in this? Because I think it's great that it's at a different venue, a different artist, different opportunity, and on the grounds of a beautiful building. So I just think Wayne did a fabulous job with all the volunteers, getting everybody together. And really, when you said you don't know if you'll do it again, I certainly hope you do, because I think you did a great job. So,
And now Laura would like to say a few words. Is it about me or can I leave?
Thank you very much. On behalf of the St. Petersburg Public Library System and the very hard work that Wayne and the Friends of Mirror Lake Library has done, we would like to say congratulations today for this wonderful event that brought attention to this beautiful stately building, our community, the arts in our building, or in our community, and our library system. Thank you all for your participation. Like Leslie, we are very excited about this type of event, and we look forward to it happening, hopefully, in years to come. Thank you very much on behalf of the library. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon to this first time that we've done a plein air competition for the artists here at Mirror Lake Library. My name is Elaine Birkinshaw. I served for 20 years with the City of St. Petersburg Library System. 6 of those years were in this building. I started here in 1991, and I just retired in January of this year. And the Mirror Lake friends asked me to come back and talk with you about the wonderful things that this building has been through in its almost 100 years. We will be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Mirror Lake Library in 2015. So it's coming up pretty quickly. This lovely building actually was opened in 1915. As you can see by the plaque on the wall over here, it's dedicated to Andrew Carnegie. I'm sure all of you have heard of Andrew Carnegie. He did much philanthropy in the United States and actually all over the world. I don't know how many of you realize that Andrew Carnegie came to this country from Scotland. He was only about 12 years old. His family came here because the economy in Scotland was in very bad shape at that time. They came here, like many immigrants do, for a new start. Andrew went to work right away to help his parents because they all needed to work in order for the family to survive. There was a man in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at that time who had a wonderful private library. And I say private library because if I take you back into the 1800s, you need to stop and realize that public libraries such as we have today did not exist very much back in the 1800s. Libraries were something that only wealthy people had. And so if you weren't wealthy, the only way to get a book was to borrow it from someone who had a private library or to pay a subscription fee, because many of the libraries in the United States at that time were what we now call a subscription library, and for a certain fee, you could take materials home from that library. That's why the work that Andrew Carnegie did was so very important for this country and for the world in general. Andrew found this man's wonderful private library, and he was one of several boys who went every Saturday and was allowed the wonderful privilege of taking home books from this man's private library. As he educated himself with books from the library, he began to really appreciate how much it means to have access to knowledge. So as he became quite successful in his business ventures, he vowed that if he had anything to do with it, boys would not have to pay for libraries ever again. He wanted libraries to be free and open to the public. In order to accomplish that, he gave away almost all of his fortune before he died, because he thought it was a sin for a rich man to die with all of his money. So his philosophy was this. He says, "I chose free libraries as the best agencies for improving the masses of the people, because they ask nothing for nothing. They only help those who help themselves. They never pauperize. They reach the aspiring and open to these chief treasures of the world, those stored up in books." And so it was that Andrew went on to become a very successful industrialist. Most of you probably know he made most of his money in steel. He also owned some railroads. And when he was a young man, he didn't even have a home. He actually lived in his railroad car, because his railroad car could take him wherever he needed to go to conduct his business. And so he had a very nice railroad car that went with him wherever he was conducting business. Eventually, of course, that life tired, and he decided that he really wanted to settle down and get married. By that time, he was already quite wealthy, and so I'm sure it wasn't too hard for him to find a wife. I know that when the ladies found out that he was available and looking, I'm sure that he had plenty of women who would be happy to be married to him. Andrew actually built his first public library in his hometown of Dunfermline, Scotland, because he knew that Scotland also needed to have public libraries, and that was his hometown. But he had some very strict rules about helping people to build libraries. He said that as far as he was concerned, he didn't mind helping get them started, but once he gave it to a city or a county or a municipality, it was up to them to keep it going. That was not his job anymore. So in order to get a Carnegie grant, the first thing that an organization had to do was to commit to half of the building funds. So the library where we're sitting today, they started negotiating with Carnegie in about 1910, 1912, somewhere in there. And the first negotiation said that they probably needed to each commit $14,500 to build this library. I found out, I have just a little light reading here about Andrew Carnegie. I found out, yes, just a little light reading. I found out through this book, which is Andrew Carnegie, written by David Nassau, that Mr. Carnegie had a way of deciding how much should be built, how much money it would take to build a library. He figured that it should be $2 for every person in the population. So when he came here to St. Petersburg initially, they based it on more or less our year-round population. But the city fathers said to him, well, you know, this is a very busy place in the winter, and our population increases a great deal. So they talked him into basing his figures on the winter population when we're much busier. And so it was that they decided to give a grant to the city of St. Petersburg to build this library. And Andrew Carnegie gave $17,500, and the city matched it with their $17,500. That's pretty amazing when you think about this beautiful building today, that it cost $35,000, but let me just tell you that that was close to $1 million in the terms of today's dollars. So although we don't think of it as a large amount of money, it indeed was a very large commitment. The other rule that Mr. Carnegie had was, you need to show me how it is that you intend to support the continuing operation of this library. Well, in Scotland, they passed a Library Act that allowed Scotland to tax people for the library. And so that was how they decided to do it in Scotland. In the city of Pittsburgh, where Andrew Carnegie also offered money for libraries, it took almost 6 years for all of them to come to an agreement, because the city of Pittsburgh wasn't sure how they were going to support it financially. Any of you who know about libraries today know that the Carnegie Library is still a very big deal in Pittsburgh. That's where a number of his libraries were built. So they did eventually come to an agreement, and Pittsburgh decided that they would build a tax structure into the city in order to add a library tax and help continue the operation of the library. The other thing that he asked was that they have a librarian. Now, those of you today probably don't think that was such a big deal. Well, it was a real big deal back in the 1800s because there weren't very many librarians. There were no real colleges established at that time in order to train librarians. So not only did Mr. Carnegie revolutionize libraries and how they were used, he also revolutionized the training of librarians, real honest-to-goodness trained librarians. So that was another thing that he had a great deal of influence over. Well, Mr. Carnegie also had a plan for how he thought a library should work. Now, they built the one in Scotland, and it was very beautiful with a stone exterior. And when they came to build in Pittsburgh, Mr. Carnegie was a little bit concerned because, you know, Pittsburgh was steel town, and the mills were very dirty. He was afraid that if they used stone to build libraries in Pittsburgh, that they would soon be black and unattractive. So he talked the library staff and the city into building the libraries with brick, because it would be less expensive to build and it would be easier to clean. And of course, if our outside of our Carnegie Library is brick. Now, most of them in the north are red brick. We happen to have a special kind of brick here that's yellow, but a lot of them are red brick. The other thing that's very interesting is today we're having a competition outside the library for artists to give us their concept on canvas of what this building looked like. Well, in around 1900, as Mr. Carnegie was starting to ramp up the building of libraries, he also established a competition for architects. And I did not know that until I read this book, and I'm going to tell you just very briefly. It says it was in October that they had decided to purchase land for a library in Pittsburgh. And so they decided to have a competition to see what architects could come up with in terms of the exterior of a library and how they thought it should look. They had 102 entries, 1,300 drawings from 96 architects in 28 cities. It was actually a major national competition to come up with a design. The commission was eventually given to the firm of Longfellow, Alden, and Harlow, and the design that was selected was the Beaux-Arts design, which is exactly what this building is. I had worked here all these years, and I did not know that the Beaux-Arts design is what Carnegie originally intended. Not every Carnegie library, I will tell you, is Beaux-Arts. Some cities decided they really did not care for it, and they designed their libraries in a different style. But that was what the winner of the competition was this beautiful design that we see now, which is a fairly symmetrical building. The other thing that he wanted was the glass that you see here so that the reading room could be private. Originally, if you look in the showcase over here, there are some photographs of the original building when it was first built. When this building was first built, the circulation desk was right in the center of this room. This building also had 2 active entrances, and actually the front door was the one toward the lake in the beginning. As the traffic pattern for St. Petersburg changed, it changed over so that this became more of the public door as we faced the rest of the city. Think about St. Petersburg in 1900. When you look at the pictures of the library sitting on this site in 1900, there was hardly anything. We were the edge of the city, which is really pretty amusing because, of course, now there's hardly a vacant piece of land around here anywhere. But back when the library was built, and I do have a photograph. Actually, it's a drawing. Well, this is actually a newer one. Let me get the other one. This is the library sitting on a rise, and you can see there's nothing around it. The only thing it was facing at that time was the lake. And many of you may or may not know, Mirror Lake was actually the city's water supply at the time. So it was sitting on a hill all by itself. And of course, then the city came this way and built up around the library. Mr. Carnegie also felt that to keep the staffing levels down and keep the cost down for the cities who ran the libraries, that the design of the library should be such that one librarian should be able to see everything in the library. And if you look around you, you'll realize that if a librarian is seated here in the center of the library, they can see this room, they can see everything that goes on in the stacks, and they have a full view. Of course, we have a wing to the library now, so that's no longer the case. But in this original building, they could see this entire floor. At the time that this building was initially opened, the lower floor, which is open now, was not being used by the public, so it was only this portion. Of course, as time went on, they outgrew this floor and expanded to the floor below us. Well, I call this building a survivor. There were 10 Carnegie libraries built in the state of Florida. Only 2 of those are operating today as public libraries. The others have all become historical centers or office buildings, and some of them are gone. The Clearwater Carnegie Library was taken down in order to build the new Clearwater Library. So some of them are gone altogether. The only 2 still surviving as public libraries are this library and the West Tampa Library. And even West Tampa was closed for a while they decided what they were going to do. They weren't sure whether they were going to save that one or not. So for a while, this was still the only operating library that was an original Carnegie in the state of Florida. Now I'm happy to say Hillsborough also renovated their Carnegie Library, and it's reopened to the public. This building, as I said, we outgrew it pretty quickly. And in 1951, there was a new architectural phenomenon that went across the country. And if you look at buildings built in the 1950s, what do you see? They're boxy, they're plain, there's not a whole lot to see, is there? Well, in 1951, the city realized that this library needed to be expanded. And so they put an addition onto the south side, which is where our addition is today. The only thing is, they built it 1950s style. I used to say it looked like a shoebox that somebody tacked onto the side of the building. And of course, it looked very strange to have this very modern building next door to this building. So in order to make it match, they covered both of them with stucco and painted it that pale industrial green that hospitals used to use. It was thrilling. Well, that meant, of course, it covered up all the beautiful architectural elements on the outside of the building, so it was pretty much just a green blob with windows. The sad part is they also did the same thing on the inside. Because air conditioning had now come to Florida, they dropped all of the ceilings in here, put in the drop ceiling grid. That meant we no longer had the beautiful lights. They put in fluorescent lighting. And they painted all of this room the same lovely green. In fact, they painted over the woodwork, And over here, will you see these beautiful windows? They painted the windows halfway up with green paint as well. It was pretty sad. Well, I'm a latecomer in terms of being a librarian. I went back to library school in the 1980s. I won't tell you how old I was. And in our basic library class where we learn about the history of libraries, our teacher said, "Oh, you must go to St. Petersburg and see the Carnegie Library. That's the only one still working." Okay, so I came all the way over here from the Tampa campus, pulled up in front of the building and thought, that can't be the building she's talking about. That's not possible. Just can't be the same building. And I went back to school and I said, that building you sent me to doesn't look anything like. She said, well, yes, they did do some renovation. I have to tell you, at that time, this entrance was completely closed off. The only way you could get into the building was in the 1951 wing. It was mildewed and dark and dingy. It was just awful. Well, little did I know when I was in library school, because I was living in Sarasota at the time, that I would eventually be a librarian in this library system. I came in 1991 as the manager of the main library over on 9th Avenue. And at that time, our director's office was also over there. We did not at that point have a manager of branches. It was pretty much the library director and me as the manager of main library. Well, in 1992, we began the renovation for this building. I will have to say our former library director, Patricia Broad, had put in an application in the 1980s through the State Historical Society. This building was placed on the historical register, and then they applied for a grant to do a renovation. She had already left when we got permission to do the renovation and got the grant from the state. So I was the lucky person to be involved when we did indeed renovate this building. And it was the most fascinating thing I've ever seen, because going from a building where everything was the same color and you couldn't really appreciate any of the architecture. Of course, the first thing they did was come in and tear down the false ceiling. And when we looked up and saw this beautiful vaulted ceiling and the lovely archways, we were astonished. We had no idea. The architects knew what was back there because they had seen some of the initial drawings. We were just amazed when they took down the ceiling and we started seeing what we were in for. Well, the construction company that did the renovation was in here for weeks and weeks and weeks, taking all the paint off the walls. There were, as you can imagine, layers and layers and layers of paint. The architects we were working with, which was the Harvard Jolly firm, actually were able to find some of the original colors for this building, which is what you're seeing today. So we don't know that they were exactly where we have them, but these are colors taken from the original colors of the building. What we didn't expect, and we're totally surprised to see, the light fixtures that you see are light fixtures that were copied after a light fixture we found up in a corner somewhere. One of the workmen came to us and said, "You have to see what I found. I think it's an original light fixture." So we sent them to a foundry, and they copied the original light fixture to come up with the ones that we have today. That was a real bonus. We were very excited about being able to do that. So when you see those today, you're pretty much seeing what was there back in 1914 or 15. And there is a picture over here in the display case of this building when it was first opened. You can tell it's when we first opened because the shelves are bare. So when you look at it, you'll see that although it's not exactly the same as it was in 1914, it's pretty close. You still get the feel for what this building looked like when it was initially opened. Well, we had another surprise along the way. Our 6-month renovation turned into more like a year and a half. I always found it fascinating that although Andrew Carnegie made his money in steel, this building didn't have any steel in it. They came to us and said, "We're going to have to delay this a little bit," because as they got back in and tore the plaster off the walls, they discovered there were no steel beams holding this building up. As the contractor said, it's basically a pile of bricks. And if you're going to spend this much money renovating this building and making it look nice, you might want to make sure it's going to stand up for a while. So it was that we delayed things while they brought some steel beams into the corners of the building to prop it up and make it stronger. The other thing they had to do is right under where I'm standing in the downstairs, if you go down there and look, there's a huge beam that runs across the ceiling. That's what was holding up this whole floor, and the termites had gotten into it. There were huge sections of the beam that had been chewed out by termites. So that was the other thing they had to do, was totally remove the beam that holds up this floor and replace it. The other thing that's probably a little strange, you've probably always wondered why this library is on so many different levels once we put the addition back onto it. Well, you know, when they built things back in 1914 and 1915, they gave no thought to the fact that some people had crutches or wheelchairs and were not able to use steps. And Mr. Carnegie's vision of the library was that it should be a place that people walked up to as thinking of libraries as being a place of elevation intellectually. And so that all the libraries should have steps that led up to them. When the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed back in the 1990s, a lot of Carnegie libraries faced challenges then because all of their buildings were built that way. Well, during the renovation, we had taken down the 1951 wing, which was a good thing. I think I stood and cheered when that came down. And we were planning on building an addition because this library was still too small without an addition. So we did bring in Harvard Jolly to design an addition to this building that complements the exterior of this beautiful building. Now you'll notice if you stand outside and look at the two pieces of the building that it's not identical. And they tell us that in historic preservation, you really should not make your new wing completely identical to your old wing, so that preservationists in years that go by can say, okay, we can see which is the new wing and which is the older building. So although it complements the architecture of this building, it's not completely the same. Now, the wonderful thing about building a new addition was it also gave us a chance to address the ADA issue. And that's why our elevator is kind of strange, because it stops on this floor and the bottom floor, and then what we call our third floor, which is really 2.5, but they didn't have a 2.5 button, so we call it number 3. That's why they're not on the same level. We are not able, at this point in time, because of Florida flood laws, to build things at the same level that this original library was built. So we had to figure a way, and our architect did a wonderful job of bringing the old and the new together. When you look at the archway that connects the two buildings, it's really very pretty. And as you go on the other side of the archway and look back this way, it's a beautiful view into the building, and you can see the exterior brick where the building was attached. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's such a pretty building. And we're glad that we were able to give it an addition that truly addresses the lovely architecture that we have today. So Carnegie was quite busy at this point in time. Our building opened in 1915, but Carnegie didn't start building libraries until 1898. He built 2,609 libraries. About 1,700 or so were built here in the United States. The others were all built overseas. So he built everywhere from Fiji to Scotland, I believe some in Africa. He built actually all over the world. And that all happened within about an 18-year time period. Mr. Carnegie passed away in 1918. So it's a good thing we got our library when we did, because we were pretty much on the tail end of it by the time it happened. There's something else that you may not know. Somebody brought up in our talk this morning Carnegie Hall, so probably you all know that he was implemented Carnegie Hall. And there's some interesting stories that go with that too. I bet you don't know that he also in his lifetime gave 6,700 organs to churches. Did you know that? I did not until I read this little short book. That was another passion of his. The church was very important in his life, and he loved music. So in addition to building Carnegie Hall, he also made sure that churches who needed them and wanted them had organs to use. The Carnegie Hall story was kind of funny because when he was building that, he traveled a lot between the United States and Europe. And they had different names for halls over there than they did here. And there was a little problem at one point about wanting to call it a music hall. So when we see Carnegie Hall now, and that's a place that artists aspire to perform, it wasn't exactly that way when he first built it. People were saying, what's he doing? What's he thinking? So it's wonderful that the Carnegie Hall has become such a wonderful place where artists aspire to perform, because when he first built it, people didn't necessarily see it that way. They thought he'd kind of gone over the edge, I think. Speaking of thinking he went over the edge, I'm sure you all know about the Dewey Decimal System. And it appears that although Melville Dewey was quite concerned with how you put a library collection together so that you organize it and people can locate things, Mr. Carnegie, of course, also had his ideas about how libraries should operate. And Mr. Dewey gave us this wonderful system to categorize things and put them on the shelf. But when he did that, he was thinking that it would be the librarians who would use that system, because at that time, the stacks were closed. So this lovely building, if it had been built a few years earlier, would have had closed stacks. Well, they started out that way, and you had to go to what was called the delivery desk and ask for your item, and the librarians would go find it in the Dewey Decimal System and bring it back to you. Well, Mr. Carnegie said, well, that doesn't seem right. He says, that way, it's only the librarians who get to look at the books and touch them and decide what they want to look at. I think the people should be able to look at the book stacks and see what they're interested in instead of having to know which book it is they want. Mr. Dewey thought Mr. Carnegie was kind of nuts. But after they built the first couple of libraries, Mr. Dewey and Mr. Carnegie insisted that delivery desk become a circulation desk, which to us is the way libraries work, right? And so it was that Mr. Carnegie insisted that the newer libraries have open stacks and that the public, oh my goodness, be allowed to come in and browse and touch the books. And that's how the libraries that we see today came to be so different. If you can imagine back in the 1900 going into a library, have any of you ever been in a closed stack library? Yeah, a couple of you have. It's a strange experience, isn't it? We're used to walking in and touching and looking and maybe taking a book off and looking at it and putting it back. Well, in a closed stack library, you don't get to do that. You need to know what book you want, and when it comes to you, if it's the wrong book, you have to take it and send it back and ask for a different one, because you can only have one at a time. So it was because of Mr. Carnegie that we now have open libraries where people can come in and look at what they want, which is a revolutionary concept. It's amazing. It's hard for us to think about that today. But back in 1900, that was a really big deal. So we went from private libraries where people had to pay to even see the books, and most of the time they had to ask for those too. Those were also mostly closed stack libraries, to an open library concept where anybody could come in and look at any book they wanted to. Really big change. So we have Andrew Carnegie to thank for the fact that we can sit here in this library today and have the freedom to look at what we want. And yes, in a sense, we do pay for it because our taxes pay for the library. On the other hand, we don't get hit up every year with a fee to continue to come in and use the library. So it was really a revolution in library science. The other thing is that Mr. Carnegie wanted every library to have Robert Burns in their collection, because as a Scot, Robert Burns was his favorite author. In fact, Mr. Carnegie memorized so much Robert Burns that he said he didn't even need the books anymore because they were all up here. And he thought he should give them to the library because other people needed to enjoy them as much as he had. So he was quite a quoter of poetry. People never knew when they were going to get treated to some Robert Burns. And because of that, we have a bust of Robert Burns here in our display case. I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't, you should take a nice look at it. The St. Andrew's Society of Tampa Bay gave us the bust to keep in this library because it said, and we haven't seen any proof of it, but it is said, that instead of busts of Carnegie, Mr. Carnegie wanted the libraries to have busts of Robert Burns because he thought he was much more important. So a couple of years ago, the St. Andrew's Society commissioned an artist to create busts of Robert Burns, and ours is sitting over here in the display case. So Robert Burns has come back to the library, and so have his books. We made sure that we also had a good selection of Robert Burns books here in the library for you. Apparently, Mr. Carnegie also liked to write and published some of his own books. I haven't seen any of them, but I'm told that he was quite a good writer, and I suppose it's because he was such an avid reader. And that's why public libraries are so important. We should never lose the fact that our public libraries should always be public. It's a scary thing sometimes when people talk about public libraries possibly going away. We need to always remember that they got here because of the vision of a particular man who was able to give that vision to the rest of the world, and we need to never lose it.